So I'm actually really fortunate to be leading the Army's expedition back to Nepal next year. So in April, we'll travel up to Namche Bazaar, and instead of turning right and going into the Khumbu and Everest's valley as such, we'll turn left and go off into Rawalin. And there, in a really quiet part of the Himalayas, we'll try and summit 2 unclimbed peaks. And in doing so, taking a combined team of British Army soldiers from across all of the cap badges, but of course with a core nucleus of Gurkhas, so that it's a first summit not only for us as the British Army, but Britain and Nepal combined. And I think that's a really important part of it, because it shows that, one, that these young people have had an amazing opportunity and great training to do so, but ultimately that we share the summit between nations, and so that it's not just a British summit, but it's shared with Nepal as well.
Initially, simply not just Everest, but pretty much everything what I dreamed about, all is over, and I didn't know what to do, how to move my life forward. I just didn't know. Later on, I slowly started doing sports and adventure, then doing indoor climbing to outdoor climbing, then I did other sports and adventure. That's how I got in. And then again, when I was skiing in the Alps, I was thinking of a mountain. I always wanted to climb the Everest. How do you think I can get over that, mountain? How to tackle the slopes and rocks? This is the thing that I used to think. And later I discussed with my friends, and I started testing myself in different terrain and different, altitude. So later, I thought, nothing is impossible. It's a different way of doing the things. It's just adapting life, adapting equipment, adapting the things that I want to do. But there's nothing impossible. That's why, my dream is just still alive. I need to go ahead.
Hello, I'm Darren Bowyer, Director of the Gurkha Museum. Welcome to this online lecture, now presented as part of our Gama Sunu, to listen at home series of online events. This lecture, Slim Sahib, by John Mackinlay, Bob Couldrey and Ray Pett, was originally conceived as a celebration of the 100th anniversary of Bill Slim joining 6th Gurkha Rifles in May 1920. Sadly, the COVID pandemic delayed its delivery until June of 2021, when it was first delivered as an in-person lecture at the Gurkha Museum in front of members of the Slim family. This online iteration will ensure this quite excellent tribute to the man voted by the public in a National Army Museum poll as Britain's greatest general is available to a wider audience than can easily travel to Winchester, and indeed is recorded for posterity. I'm immensely grateful to our speakers for giving their time so freely to do this for us, and to you for joining us. This online series is presented free of charge, but if you are in a position to do so, please consider making a donation to help us continue our work of preserving and promoting the history and heritage of Britain's Gurkhas. Thank you.
Good evening. My entry point into the story of our hero, Captain W.J. Slim, is what was for him a life-changing event which took place on the 8th of August 1915. The theatre of war was the Gallipoli Peninsula, and you can see the Turkish line in a series of red dots across the Sahib feature, and then coming in from the left, the arrows which depict Hamilton's attack on that day. Now, the precise spot where this event took place is this spur, which is on the top of the Sahib Ridge, some 300 yards short of the Turkish line. And you can see the end of the blue arrow. If you had been standing there at the tip of that blue arrow on that day, looking up towards the Turkish line above you, you would have been confronted by a thunderous sound of gunfire as salvo after salvo of the Allied bombardment detonated along that ridgeline. And somewhere at this spot shown here emerged temporary Second Lieutenant W.J. Slim with the remains of a company of the 9th Battalion Royal Warwickshire Regiment. And then from the spur above came this officer, Major Cecil Allinson, who was commanding the 1st Battalion 6th Gurkha Rifles, who were astride the Chumchuk Punar spur. And for a moment, these two officers stood in that ravine discussing the possibility that Slim's company would join with the 1st 6th in the forthcoming assault. And then the bombardment stopped. And for a moment, there was this tremendous silence all along the Sahib Ridge. And then the sound of whistles, and you could have seen the men rising out of their shell scrapes and moving upwards towards the Turkish line in a very weary fashion. Then small arms fire broke out. Slim was badly hit. He fell down on the Chumchuk Punar ridge, and a series of men passed over him, and then finally a stretcher carried him away to the rear area. In this first part, what I want to do is explain how he got to this place very briefly, and in much more detail where he went to afterwards. William Joseph Slim, born 6th August 1891, and then the family moved very shortly after that to Birmingham, where he and his brother were educated mainly I think, at St. Philip's Grammar School at Edgbaston. The next event was that Slim left school aged 17 to start a teacher training course in Birmingham, which is probably when this photograph was taken, showing what a good-looking young man he was. The next event was in 1912. Slim joined the Birmingham University OTC, so that by 1914, at the declaration of war, he was poised with thousands of others to be commissioned as a temporary second lieutenant, so that on mobilization he went from the recruiting office to the depot to the training center, joined up with his platoon, and there he is in the middle of his platoon of conscripted soldiers mainly, and then finally heading for the Dardanelles to take part in that attack with the 9th Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. Obviously, he survived, but he's now medically downgraded because he was very seriously wounded and forbidden by the medical corps to ever take part in active operations again. Nevertheless, he wrangled his way back to the 9th Battalion, who were then in Mesopotamia, where he did remarkably well. He got an MC during their advance to Kut and was wounded again, to the fury of the medical corps, who then realized that he had been evading their restrictions for the last 2 years, who sent him to Bombay on an enforced convalescence to what they felt must be a no-escape venue. Moving on now, 1920, the war was over, but Slim was still in India as a temporary staff officer, now working in the headquarters at Delhi. But significantly, he was regimentally homeless and therefore petitioning to join the Indian Army. However, transferring into the Indian Army was hard to do unless you had a godfather who was in the Indian Army already, and this Slim did not have. And then, like a miracle, on the 27th of March 1920, there came a posting order to the 1st Battalion of all the regiments in the line of the Indian Army, the 1st Battalion of the 6th Gurkha Rifles. And of course, this is really where the story of Slim Sahib begins. The 6th were on active duty on the Afghan frontier, and they were part of the frontier force, stationed at Abbottabad, which was in the foothills, and as you can see from this map, it's just a few days' march from the Afghan border to the north. Abbottabad, a great place to be. Purpose-built Victorian garrison town, beautifully laid out, and as you pan over to the right of this photograph, you can see there were these spaces at the edge of the cantonment where you could do this sort of thing in the early morning. It had a garrison church like a cathedral, and you can see beneath the trees the size of that building. And then there were 3 fabulous messes which housed the 3 regiments that were stationed there. There was the 13th Frontier Force Rifles, magnificent locally recruited regiment, who were supported by 2 mountain batteries of the Indian Mountain Regiment, and then the fabulous 5th, hugely respected, operationally very successful, professionally this regiment was at the top of their game, and socially absolutely the regiment to be in. So much so that 20 years previously, when the 6th first arrived in Abbottabad, the 5th were rather snooty about us, looking down on us possibly as a rather unfashionable Assam regiment. But these feelings of superiority were rather dented after 6th won the Cud race 5 years in succession, the significance being that the Cud race was invented by the 5th and their special area. You know, I doubt whether our man really minded that the 6th weren't regarded as fashionable, because what mattered far more to him was that they were professional. Because on the frontier, being professional was a whole lot more important than the colour of your shirts or the cut of your trousers. In every sense, this was a wild place, dissected by these powerful rivers, and on either side these steep mountain passes. And it was a ruthless place where regiments and commanders could make their reputation, but far more easily lose their reputation. the frontier land was tribally divided, and each of these tribes was armed, and each tribe violently resisted any attempt by government or rival tribes to dominate their space. And of course the result of that was that there was this continuous cross-border violence, raids, vengeance killings, kidnap, murder, you name it, whatever abominations there could be, they took place on the borders. And this meant that when a military force marched into the tribal areas, every crest line, every pass, every ford, every bend in the track was tactically significant. If you looked up, the surrounding hills might seem empty, but there was always someone watching, ready for the intruding force to make a mistake, which would allow local tribesmen to rush in and ambush that isolated quartermaster's wagon, which had become straggling behind the military force. So, when the military force deployed from Abbottabad, and here we are, 6 Gurkhas are deploying from Abbottabad, and if you look carefully at this fabulous photograph, right back you can see the whole battalion until at the end there is the officer's charger being led along the trail. So when we marched out of Abbottabad, we went in fours at considerable speed along these arterial roads, and then as we approached the area of contest, we changed formation and start sending these pickets up onto the high ground to secure the route. And when a picket reached the top, it would turn and look down onto the track below and protect the column that passed. And once the column had passed, they'd put up a red flag, and these pickets had to leap out of their positions and run helter-skelter down into the ravine below to avoid the sniper fire. And if a man was hit or fell, you had to get up there and get him out before the tribesmen could get to him. Now, the reason that I'm banging on at such length about this is that if you were going to do this effectively, your battalion had to be absolutely top of its game. Each man had to be really fit, very sure-footed. Look at this guy, he's got legs like tree trunks and a reliable shot, because on the frontier you didn't get a chance. And it followed, therefore, that the commanders were very visible. It stands to reason. If you could see the whole battalion on the march, they can see you. And you needed, therefore, to have a presence. You had to communicate convincingly. You had to know the things that made them laugh, what made them cheer. And when they were down and exhausted, you had to know how to urge them on. Slim could do this with British soldiers, and now he had to learn a completely new officer-soldier relationship. New languages, Urdu, Nepali, survival Pushtun. Because on the frontier, he was surrounded by all these different races and cultures. At a peace negotiation like this, the 6 Gurkha, who's the guy smoking a pipe on the left of the photograph, has got to be pretty good in Nepali, because those men standing up are his men and they're protecting this meeting. He's got to be pretty good in Urdu, because there's local government officials there that he's got to communicate with, and he's got to be good in Pushtun to get the tribal leaders to get their people in the right and welcome them generally to the meeting. The point about all this is that Slim was increasingly becoming part of a family, the Indian Army family. He'd passed what John Masters used to describe as the moment of approval. And back at Abbottabad, when he strode through the lines, men from these different ethnicities would greet him, "Salam, Slim Sahib," and he would have to respond to their banter, get them to laugh at his jokes, and above all, understand his concerns. His closest friends were now 6 Gurkhas. Bruce Scott shared his bungalow. Punch Cowan shared his essays, his officer homework essays, because Slim's essays were always the best ones. Gibbos was his faithful correspondent through the coming war. Slim had moved a long way in his professional development from this slightly anxious man, look at the left of the photograph, sitting on the edge of his chair surrounded by these conscripted soldiers, to the adjutant, leaning back, master of the universe, the battalion adjutant, surrounded by his jaunty buglers and who were his instruments of control and his messengers. And finally, most important of all, is during that sunlit period of his life, depicted on the right of that photograph, that he fell in love. It all happened in a very Indian Army fashion as he was returning to India at the end of his first leave, and this is how Aileen Robertson saw it. She and her aunt were sailing to India for a long holiday, and as they came aboard the ship, she looked up and saw this young man leaning over the rail, regarding her in a very uber attentive fashion. And then later, by an extraordinary coincidence, the same young man had been allocated a seat at their dinner table, not just for that evening, but for the entire voyage to Bombay. Captain Slim, the young man in question obviously, had spotted Aileen and her aunt and taken immediate action, found out who they were, buttonholed the ship's purser, probably slipped him a brown envelope or two, and persuaded him to be seated at the same table. And of course, by the time the ship reached Bombay, they had fallen in love. But as the ship docked, problems lay ahead. Captain Slim's leave had definitely expired, and Aileen and her aunt were definitely booked to leave for Kashmir on the frontier mail. But fate clearly wanted this union to take place. And when Slim rang up in a rather blustering way, trunk call from Bombay to the battalion office, to his joy he found the CO was away, and guess who was acting as CO in his absence? Bruce Scott, who gallantly authorized a further 10 days leave. So Slim ended up in Kashmir in the houseboat that was moored next door to Aileen and her aunt. And they were married on New Year's Day at St Andrew's Church in Bombay. And at this point, I hand you over to Bob, who's going to unfold the next phase, a rather different phase of his career as an Indian Army staff officer.
Quetta. Slim had passed into the Indian Staff College at Quetta, top of the list. His marks were so high that if he'd wished to, he could have gone to Camberley. He completed his staff course in 1928, and it seems hardly surprising that he also finished top. However, at the end of his first year, most unusually, he got a report that stated could do well if he worked, which he has not, might be brilliant, has ideas and originality, does not play games, but is sufficiently active. Perhaps being recently married for a short period, he took his eye off the ball. Anyway, one of his instructors was Percy Hobart, the leading proponent on mobile warfare, a man who had had no truck with idleness, and they would become lifelong friends, and fellow students had little doubt as to who was the star of their year. And so it was inevitable that such a talented officer should be posted at a grade 2 level to the important operations directorate of General Headquarters in Delhi. And one of his responsibilities was for operations on the northwest frontier. His fertile mind soon conceived that operations there would be much more effective with greater use of aircraft, both for close air support and also for resupply. He was way ahead of his time. Suitable aircraft and equipment did not exist. There were no funds, and when the RAF heard of his ideas, he was told to get back into his box. But the germ of the idea was there, which would of course manifest itself much later in Burma. All of us
who have had the privilege of reading Slim's defeat into victory and his unofficial history can understand that for him on occasions the pen could indeed be mightier than the sword. His great interest in literature had taught him to write well, and this had been proven at the Staff College. In short, an officer highly effective with both the written and the spoken word. In 1930, he had taken over the editorship of the United Services Institute Journal, and as described to his lifelong civilian friend Philip Pratt, they'd first met at school, "We publish quarterly, and it's rather fun. But my God, the tosh people send in for publication." Unknown to his brother officers, Slim had also found a way to supplement his army salary. Under the nom de plume of Anthony Mills, he regularly wrote stories, often with an Indian flavour. And Philip Pratt acted as his literary agent and succeeded in getting these tales published in a whole variety of titles, from the Daily Mail, Evening News, Daily Sketch, to Women's Journal, Good Housekeeping, and many others. And I've read some of them, and they are cracking tales. Militarily, he was on an upward spiral, but he had one great disadvantage. He was old for his rank. In 1932, as he completed his Grade 2 staff job as a major, he was aged 41. The Staff College at Camberley always had one instructor from the Indian Army. And in 1934, Slim, as a brevet lieutenant colonel, but with a significant loss of income compared with Indian Army rates, took over from Jackie Smythe, VC, whose career would subsequently come to an abrupt end after the Sitang Bridge disaster in Burma in 1942. And Slim was to earn the respect of both his fellow instructors and students alike. When he finished his tenure in 1936, the then Commandant Lord Gort recommended that he should be accelerated to colonel as soon as possible. Perhaps slightly unusually, in 1937, he moved on as the only Indian Army member, as students were then known, to the Imperial Defence College in London. He missed some of the course, including his course photograph, being in hospital with gallbladder problems. And this photograph, taken in 1946, shows him as the first commandant as the college reopened after the Second World War. And somebody probably got bollocked for not cutting the grass. He was not over enamoured with the syllabus, but he was to rub shoulders with a whole host of officers of all three services, British and Empire, who would have positions of great responsibility in World War II. At this time, he was confiding to Philip Pratt his concerns about being too old to be promoted, that there were financial problems, and that perhaps he should seek employment outside the army. It's not known whether he was given reassurances about his future, or he made the decision to soldier on himself. But in early 1938, now aged 47, he returned to India to be a student again at the Senior Officers' School at Belgaum. Has any officer ever been so involved, both as a student and a directing staff, in staff training? He was finally given command of a battalion at age 47 in July 1938, when he took over command of 2nd 7th Gurkhas in Shillong in Assam, the battalion having only recently moved there from Quetta. Because of his age, for this to happen, a special exemption had to be made. And it's an interesting element of the Slim story that he was given command of a battalion so late, something that can be discussed at a later date. Again, it is not known whether Slim had been warned that his tenure might be short, or whether there was any significance that he was sent to 2nd 7th. But the regimental newsletter says, Colonel Slim has everyone's sympathy in being pitchforked into a battalion that he hardly knows at all. But we hope very much that we will be able, before long, to make him glad that he came. Ronald Lewin's book describes Slim's view on the situation. On taking over, he was unaccompanied by Aileen, and writing to Pratt, he said that he had to pull the unit together, that he was the garrison commander. I know no one here, and there are a lot of unpleasant jobs to be done. My two predecessors were all for a quiet life. I had to tell two worthy Gurkha Havildar majors that being over 40 years old, they could not become officers. Unfortunately, before I arrived, they had been told that they could. And now, poor devils, they think it's entirely due to the arrival of a shit of a new colonel. They would probably willingly kill me, and I don't altogether blame them. People who put off unpleasant duties want a particular warm corner in the next world. However, he introduced some imaginative training, and on one occasion happily playing the part of a very dodgy spy. His frustration was not improved when a month's jaunt he had been promised to attend Dutch manoeuvres in Java was cancelled because of the Munich crisis. Aileen joined him in December, and then rather surprisingly, he handed over 2nd 7th in March 1939 to return to Balgam with a temporary rank of brigadier, and this time as the commandant. Slim had stated that the 4 best commands in the army are those of a platoon, a battalion, a division, and an army. But for him, commanding 2nd 7th for just 8 months was perhaps disappointing. However, there must have been some empathy, because in March 1944, when 1st 7th was serving with 17 Indian Division at Imphal, and the re-raised 2nd 7th were part of the 4th Indian Division at Casino, he became Colonel of the 7th Gurkhas, an appointment he would hold for 12 years. The Second World War was, of course, to be the making of Slim, and when war was declared, he showed his steely determination by immediately going to Army headquarters to press his case for an active command. And on the 23rd of September, he was rewarded with the command of 10th Indian Brigade at Jhansi, comprising battalions of Baluch, Garhwalis and Punjabis. Although trained for the frontier, the brigade was warned off for possible operations in North Africa, meaning a mechanised role. Initially, there were virtually no train drivers and no transport. But Slim's enthusiasm and inventiveness was infectious. Amongst other measures, he persuaded the district commissioner to produce driving instructors from local garages, and civilian volunteers also helped. This "God helps those who help themselves" dictum would of course be very apparent in Burma. In September 1940, Slim's brigade, as part of the 5th Indian Division, although initially intended for deployment in Iraq, disembarked in the Sudan. They would join Wavell's campaign to evict and destroy the strong Italian forces in East Africa. Slim's first task was to recapture Galabat, highlighted on the map, a strong point close to the border with Ethiopia. He was not pleased that a reorganisation had been imposed upon him, and he'd had to trade in his Punjabis for a battalion of the Essex Regiment. He always deemed this first battle as a commander in early November 1940 as a failure, as he had not taken the bolder option to carry out his task. It was a messy action with failures from his small tank force, the elimination by the Italian Air Force of his own small air element, and a reluctance from the British battalion to fully participate. Against his better judgment, he ordered a temporary withdrawal. In due course, the enemy in turn retreated, and he achieved his objective, but not in the manner he would have wished. And these stills are from a British film of the time. First of all, Bren gun carriers, the infantry, the cavalry, and there's the commander himself. In January 1941, whilst on a recce, his vehicles were suddenly attacked by 2 Italian fighters. Slim was badly wounded and evacuated to Khartoum. His cable to Aileen indicated the nature of the wound. Nothing to worry about, but shall not sit down comfortably for a few weeks. And so now, a brigadier without a brigade, it was time to spend in Simla, recuperating with the family. And then it was back to GHQ in Delhi to draw up plans to thwart any German successes in the Caucasus that would threaten Middle East oil fields and the possible defection of Iraq to the Axis cause. Slim was appointed Chief of Staff to General Quinnan, who would command the expeditionary force, of which the major formation would be the 10th Indian Division of General Fraser. The latter, on arrival in Iraq, fell ill, and Slim, very much in the right spot, took over command of the division on the 15th of May 1941. And one of the first units he visited under his command was 2nd 7th Gurkhas. The threat to Iraq had really been seen off before Slim's arrival, and by early June he was back in Baghdad, 25 years after he had first arrived there as a victor. The dotted line shows the advance of 10th Indian Division in 1941, first of all up through Iraq, and then into southeastern Syria, and then eventually turning to the east and moving into Iran. But now there was a new enemy, the Vichy French in Syria. The Allies perceived that a Vichy French regime there could easily be pressurized by Germany into causing the Allies considerable difficulties. So Syria needed to be taken out of the war. An Australian division would invade Syria from Palestine, while Slim's division was to advance from west of Baghdad into southeast Syria with a final objective of Aleppo in the north of the country. The Vichy French had a very capable air force, whilst that of the Allies was minimal. Slim's main problem was transport and mobility. Even with the requisitioning of civilian vehicles and with very limited fuel, he could only move one brigade to his concentration area at Abu Kamal on the border. And his first objective, which is highlighted, was Deir ez-Zor, the site of the only bridge crossing of the Euphrates for hundreds of miles. Slim's plan typically envisaged a wide sweeping movement by part of his force, which would mean that the French would also be attacked from the rear. This bold part of the plan was at risk of failing through lack of fuel. But his logisticians managed with great difficulty to find sufficient petrol. And unlike Gallabat in the Sudan, Slim, in spite of these extreme difficulties, stuck to his bold plan and was rewarded with a resounding success. The bridge was taken intact on the 3rd of July, and 2 weeks later, all French resistance in Syria ceased. But now the focus turned towards Iran. With the Germans invading Russia, the latter was also becoming concerned with Iran's unstable regime and its support for significant numbers of German fifth columnists operating in that country. And so a joint plan was drawn up, with the Russians advancing from the north and the British, in the form of the 10th Indian Division, invading from the west. And on the 25th of August 1941, Slim crossed his fifth frontier in 12 months. Although his force faced a well-armed Iranian army, there was little action before the Iranians agreed to a ceasefire. However, one incident in the Pai Tak Pass, described by John Masters, then adjutant of 2nd 4th Gurkhas, the battalion being part of the advance guard, gives some idea of the calibre of the commander of the 10th Indian Division. And Masters states, "A khaki saloon appeared coming down to us from the direction of the enemy-held pass. The car was obviously unarmed and flying a red divisional flag from the radiator cap. It stopped beside us and General Slim got out. How the hell did he get past us, I thought. Morning, Willie, that's the name of the CO. There's nothing until you get round the 4th hairpin. They've got an anti-tank gun there, and there was a very large hole through the back of the General's car." On the 28th of August, all resistance ceased. The Iranian government fell, and the Shah abdicated in favour of his son. British and Russian forces occupied the country, eventually entering Tehran in mid-September. Slim met his Russian opposite number, the jovial General Novikov, They got on well, especially at feasts involving a high consumption of vodka. Iran was now secure and would become an important route for supplies to Russia. In early 1942, 10th Indian Division was withdrawn back to Iraq to train for whatever the future might bring. But in early March, Slim was informed that he needed to be back in India in 3 days' time. I now hand over to Ray.
10 years ago, the National Army Museum held a competition to choose Britain's greatest general. The joint winners were Wellington and Slim. Mountbatten described him as the finest British general of World War II, and John Keegan wrote, "Unlike Montgomery, the only other consistently successful general, Slim possessed a natural authority and humanity." What made him so special, and why is he remembered with such respect and affection? The highlight of his career was the war in Burma, where he was known as Slim Sahib to his Indian and Gurkha troops, or Uncle Bill to thousands of British officers and soldiers. George MacDonald Fraser of the Flashman novels, then a 19-year-old Lance Corporal in the Border Regiment, explained his power to inspire thus: "The biggest boost to morale was the burly man who came to talk to the assembled battalion. It was unforgettable. Slim was the only man I've ever seen who had a force that came out of him. British soldiers don't love their commanders, much less worship them. 14th Army trusted Slim and thought of him as one of themselves. And perhaps his real secret was that the feeling was mutual. My father-in-law, then a lieutenant colonel in the 2nd Punjab Regiment, recalled sitting on an upturned crate, spellbound as Slim addressed his battalion. By the time Slim took over command of the Burma Corps in March 1942, he had advanced from major to acting Major General in less than 4 years. And within another 2 months, he was a temporary Lieutenant General, a meteoric rise. It did not go to his head, however. He remained affable, likeable, and easy to trust, but he ruthlessly sacked commanders who were incompetent. Boer Corps, as it was known, consisted of 1st Burma and 17th Indian Divisions, under his old 6th Gurkha colleagues of 20 years, Bruce Scott and Punch Cowan. They had urged Alexander, the army commander, to bring in Slim to give Corps the inspiration and grip that it needed. Burma was strategically important to Japan for its oil, rice, timber and rubber, and for its direct route to India. In April 1942, however, before Slim had time to start creating a force capable of beating the Japanese, Boer Corps was attacked on multiple fronts by a more numerous, flexible and determined enemy, the Japanese 15th Army. Slim soon found himself conducting a fighting withdrawal from central Burma into India, the longest retreat in British military history, over 900 miles. This not only brought the Japanese to the Indian border, but cut the US air and road supply routes to Chiang Kai-shek's army, fighting the Japanese in China. Boer Corps lost all its heavy weapons, ammunition, transport and supplies, and had over 13,000 casualties, compared with less than 5,000 Japanese. The Japanese now occupied the whole of Burma. It was the Indian Army's equivalent of Dunkirk. Back in India, Slim took over command of 15 Corps in May 1942. He fell out with the Eastern Army commander, General Irwin, who took personal control of the Corps advance back into Burma, which was a disaster. Irwin attempted to blame Slim and sacked him as Corps commander, but soon sent him the famous signal, "You're not sacked, I am." Lord Wavell, the Viceroy, Sir Alan Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, head of the army, and even Churchill had rallied to Slim's support. His reputation was already widespread. In August 1943, Slim was promoted to acting general and given command of the new 14th Army. By 1945, it included 13 divisions, 8 Indian, 2 British, 2 West African and 1 East African, as well as an Indian and Gurkha parachute brigade. Slim quickly got on with the task of retraining his new army. He declared that off-road mobility was paramount. Heavy equipment was exchanged for mule or air-transported equipment. Motor transport was restricted to vehicles that could cope with some of the worst terrain on Earth. He therefore planned and trained to operate on light scales and to use the jungle, shunning roads when necessary. Great War-style linear attacks were replaced with encirclement and ambushes. Massive artillery bombardments, which had little or no effect on Japanese bunkers in the jungle, were concentrated instead on their supply routes. There was a huge increase in air offensive support and air resupply. Slim's new doctrine dictated that if the Japanese had cut his lines of communication, then they too were surrounded. He instigated offensive patrolling and night training to encourage his soldiers to lose both their fear of the jungle and their belief that Japanese soldiers were better jungle fighters. Slim instituted evacuating the wounded by air, which did wonders for morale, as well as speeding up their return to the front line. Fighting skill and spirit was not just installed in the teeth arms units, but also in the myriad logistic and administrative outfits. He turned the latter into confident, self-reliant fighting troops who could defend themselves and their vehicles, stores and locations against Japanese attack. They often had to, forming defensive boxes. There were no cushy base wallers in 14th Army. Cooks, drivers, clerks, storemen, staff officers and everyone else had to handle themselves and a full range of weapons in action. Slim was everywhere, checking and exhorting. John Masters recalls a speech in which Slim told his officers, "What makes a soldier go on? Alone, determined to break the will of the enemy opposite him, is morale, pride in himself as an independent, thinking man who knows why he's there and what he's doing. Absolute confidence that the best has been done for him and his fate is now in his own hands." Slim imbued in his men mental stamina, a toughness, tenacity and courage in the face of overwhelming odds, including the terrain and the climate. During the monsoon season, for instance, there was rainfall of up to 20 inches a week, roughly the average in London for a whole year. More than simply repelling the enemy and defending India, Slim's intention was the utter destruction of the Japanese army in Burma. Slim's popular avuncular image could be misleading. He was clever and exceptionally knowledgeable about the art of war. He had, after all, taught at the Staff College, and he had studied with many future senior commanders at the Imperial Defence College. He was a brilliant strategist. He outmaneuvered rather than outfought the Japanese. Slim could act swiftly and boldly when he had to change his plans at short notice. In March 1944, when the Japanese advanced from Burma into India more swiftly than Slim had expected, he ordered his men to hold their ground, forbade any retreat, and told them that if they were surrounded, air supply would allow them to hold out, which it did. He airlifted 2 entire divisions straight into battle from the Arakan in Burma to relieve Imphal in India, using British and American air support to sustain both Imphal and Kohima. He knew that if Kohima fell, the Japanese could sever the Assam Railroad at Dimapur, cutting off 14th Army from its main supply line. On the 1st of June 1944, almost on the eve of D-Day, Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke wrote in his diary that he saw disaster staring us in the face. But Slim was more self-confident, believing he could smash the Japanese attempt to take India. The view in the War Cabinet was that the Indian Raj was on its last legs and the war in Burma was a sideshow. Yet, had Slim lost, the Japanese could well have overrun India with incalculable consequences. The fierce battles in Imphal and Kohima were the equivalent of the Somme. After close and bloody fighting, however, often hand to hand, the Japanese were defeated and fell back into Burma in disarray. Of the 150,000 Japanese soldiers who invaded India in March 1944, almost all of them were dead by July that year, mostly from sickness and disease after their supplies ran out. Slim had inflicted the largest defeat that Japan had suffered up to that point in the war. In December 1944, Slim launched his own offensive into Burma, with supply lines stretching almost to breaking point across hundreds of miles of trackless jungle. His excellent working relationships with the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force ensured that he could rely on air resupply at unprecedented levels, as well as intimate fighter and fighter-bomber support. Slim deceived the Japanese into thinking that the main crossing point on the river Irrawaddy would be near Mandalay, but 4 Corps was moved further south 100 miles, 300 miles altogether, to cross near Mackinlay, thus cutting off the Japanese from their supplies. General Kimura, the Japanese CNC, described the Battle of Mackinlay in February-March 1945 as the masterstroke of Allied strategy. The Japanese lost 5,000 killed, as well as their major supply dumps and airfields, leading to massive further deaths. By March 1945, Mackinlay and Mandalay were secured, and 14th Army pressed on to Rangoon in the south, which was taken by a Gurkha parachute assault and a divisional amphibious landing. Burma was back in Allied hands. Slim had turned the new, untried 14th Army into a formidable fighting machine, which under his inspiring leadership routed a much larger Japanese army in Burma, sweeping 1,000 miles from inside India throughout the length of Burma by May 1945, killing 100,000 Japanese on the way. Churchill wrote, "The famous 14th Army, under the masterful command of General Slim, fought valiantly, overcame all obstacles, and achieved the seemingly impossible. Rarely in British military history, if ever, has a senior commander, having been soundly beaten, gone on to reorganize and retrain his defeated troops, and then lead them against the same enemy in the same theatre of war to resounding and total victory." Above all, Slim Sahib was a truly outstanding leader who could inspire exhausted, hungry, and demoralized soldiers and their commanders. He spent a third of his time visiting and talking to his troops. Slim was no soft Mr. Nice Guy, however. He ruthlessly enforced standards. For example, he inherited a terrible rate of malarial infection, which accounted for 120 medical evacuations in 1942-43 for every wounded soldier, with battalions on average losing 12 men a day to malaria. Do the math. He imposed and enforced daily swallowing of anti-malarial drugs. Following his snap inspections, 3 commanding officers were summarily sacked because daily intake was less than 95%, a lesson that spread like wildfire and reduced the incidence of malaria tenfold. Slim had nothing but disdain for the Japanese army. He never saw them as supermen, as so many others did. Whilst recognizing their initially superior training and tactics, he was disgusted by their wanton cruelty. Early in the war, he heard that a victorious Japanese unit tied 12 wounded British soldiers to trees and bayoneted them in front of Burmese villages. They regularly used Indian prisoners of war for target practice and civilians for bayonet practice. At the war's end, General MacArthur, the Supreme Allied CNC, ordered that Japanese commanders should be allowed to retain their swords and not be disgraced in front of their men. Slim ignored the order, however. In Slim's Southeast Asia Command, all Japanese senior officers were made to surrender their swords to British officers in front of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war. Slim wrote later, "No Japanese soldier who has seen his general march up and hand over his sword would ever doubt that the invincible army was invincible no more. General Kimura's sword ended up on Slim's mantelpiece, and General Tanaka's, shown here, is now in the Gurkha Museum. So, what gave Slim Sahib his inner core and made him the extraordinary leader that he was? Slim wrote, "I first met the 6th Gurkhas in 1915 in Gallipoli. There I was so struck by their bearing in one of the most desperate battles in history that I resolved, should the opportunity come, to try to serve with them. 4 years later I was lucky. It came, and I spent many of the happiest, and from a military point of view, the most valuable years of my life in the regiment." Captain Slim had become Slim Sahib, and it clearly shaped his view on life and the army. He wrote, "The Gurkha expects from his officers a standard as high as his own." There were only 8 British officers in the Gurkha battalion between the wars, the other officer posts being held by experienced Viceroy commissioned officers. Gurkhas commissioned from the ranks. Experience in command was thrust early upon the few British officers, often during active service on the northwest frontier. He was a lifelong enthusiast of the military qualities of Gurkhas and knew well the capabilities of Indian units and formations. He had also served in operations with British units and knew what made them tick. Apart from his 2 British and 3 African divisions, his 8th Indian Army divisions all contained a considerable number of British infantry, armoured, artillery and logistics units. Overall, however, less than 20% of the 14th Army were British, with 17% from Africa and 64% from India and Nepal. Slim Sahib could easily converse with them in fluent Gurkhali, Urdu, the working language of the Indian Army, and Pashto, and also, significantly, the sort of English that British squaddies easily understood. On one occasion, after one of his inspiring talks before a battle, a soldier called out, "Don't worry, sir, we'll be right behind you." "Oh, no, you won't," Slim replied. I'll be well behind you." They loved his honesty. I am no Slim, but having commanded a British battalion and a Gurkha brigade, I learnt that what works with Brits doesn't necessarily work with Gurkhas, and vice versa. Slim also had the self-confidence and leadership skills to handle awkward characters, like Ord Wingate or the American Vinegar Joe Stilwell, seen here with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who would serve only under Slim of all the senior British generals. Slim established good rapport with Chinese commanders operating in northern Burma, up to 6 divisions at one stage, and with General Bogyo Kang Son, the commander of the nascent Burmese army. He was initially anti-British, but he switched his support from the Japanese to the 14th Army after meeting Slim. In his superb book, MacDonald Fraser described Slim with that robber baron face under the Gurkha hat and his carbine slung, looking like a rather scruffy private with a general's tabs, which of course he was. Well, this was not strictly true. Slim had indeed been briefly a private soldier, but he was commissioned early in World War I. It suited him, however, to encourage the up-from-the-ranks image, although senior officers knew perfectly well that he was a brilliant officer. He told a group of officers and sergeants, "I have commanded every kind of formation, from a section upwards to this army, which happens to be the largest in the world." It was then 1 million strong. "I understand the British soldier because I have been one." Poetic license, but very effective. Slim was held in enormous respect by those former Indian Army officers who went on to lead their newly independent armies after independence and partition. In May 1948, he was approached by both India and Pakistan to become C&C of their respective armies, but he declined. He retired from the army and became deputy chairman of the railway executive. I know, if only he had stayed. Montgomery churlishly refused to endorse Slim as his successor as CIGS, the head of the British Army. The Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who had fought alongside the 6th Gurkhas at Gallipoli, brought back Slim from retirement in January 1949, however, to universal acclaim. Slim Sahib was the first and last British officer from the Indian Army to be appointed as the Chief of the Imperial General Staff in the rank of Field Marshal. I'd like to end with a quote from Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, describing Claudio. He was wont to speak plain and to the purpose, like an honest man and a soldier. That was Slim Sahib.